I watched my aunt snatch the envelope out of my grandmother's hands and drop it straight into the kitchen sink, turn the tap on, and walk away laughing. The ink bleeding through the wet paper. My grandmother's face, not angry, just tired. The way she reached over and turned off the tap herself, like she already knew this was exactly how it was going to go. My name is Lydia, and I am 28 years old. I work as a junior accountant at a mid-sized firm in Mississauga, Ontario, and I live in a one-bedroom apartment that I share with a rescue cat named Pepper, who has exactly one working eye and an outsized opinion about meal times. My life is unremarkable by most standards. I pay my bills on time. I cook most of my meals. I call my grandmother every Sunday at 11 in the morning because she likes to talk before her afternoon shows start. I say all of that so you understand what kind of person I am before I tell you what happened, because what happened sounds like something that would only occur to dramatic people, and I have never once in my life considered myself dramatic. My grandmother, I call her Nan, is 79 years old. She grew up in a small town outside of Halifax and moved to Ontario in her early 20s when she married my grandfather, who has been gone for 11 years now. She has 3 children. My mother, who passed away when I was 14 from an illness that took her faster than any of us were prepared for. My aunt, who is my mother's older sister, and who I will call my aunt because that is what she is. Though lately the word feels like it belongs in quotation marks. And my uncle, my mother's younger brother, who lives 40 minutes away from Nan and visits her roughly as often as a solar eclipse. I was raised after my mother died, partly by my Nan and partly by myself. My father remarried when I was 16 and moved to BC. I stayed. I enrolled in community college, transferred to university, and finished a degree in accounting while working part-time at a grocery store and later at a tax prep office. Nan came to my convocation. She brought a card with a $20 bill inside and apologized that it wasn't more. I told her I was going to frame the 20. She thought I was joking. I wasn't. We have always been close in the way that people who have quietly needed each other can be close. Not performatively, not for show, just present. She is the person I call when something goes wrong, and I am the person who shows up when her back is acting up and she needs someone to drive her to physio. My aunt and uncle have a different relationship with Nan. My aunt lives in Oakville in a house that is, by my estimation, about 4,000 square feet, and she drives a vehicle that costs more than I make in a year. Her husband is in commercial real estate. They are comfortable in the specific way that makes some people forget what discomfort ever felt like. My uncle is not wealthy but has always moved through the world as though he expected to become so shortly. He is between careers with impressive regularity. Neither of them calls Nan on Sundays. Neither of them drives her to physio. I am telling you all of this because context matters. Because what happened last October did not come out of nowhere. It came out of decades of small choices that nobody was keeping score of, or so I thought. It started with Thanksgiving. Nan called me the Thursday before the long weekend and asked if I was coming to my aunt's house for dinner. I told her I hadn't been invited. There was a pause on the line that told me everything I needed to know. Nan said my aunt must have forgotten to call me. I said I was sure that was it. I spent Thanksgiving weekend reorganizing my bookshelves and making a very good roast chicken for one. Pepper ate the skin off the cutting board when I turned my back. It was fine, really. In November, Nan called me on a Tuesday, which was unusual. She said she'd been doing some planning and that she wanted me to come by that weekend. She sounded careful in the way she sometimes gets when she's trying to say something difficult without alarming anyone. I drove out to her house in Burlington on Saturday morning. She made tea. She sat across from me at her kitchen table, which still has the same vinyl cloth on it that I remember from being 8 years old, and she folded her hands the way she does, and she said, "I've been getting my affairs in order." I told her not to talk like that. She said, "I'm 79, Lydia. It's responsible." She told me she'd been working with a lawyer, a woman she'd been referred to through her bank, to update her will and settle some accounts. She told me she had more saved than most people knew. She said my grandfather had been careful all his life and that she had been careful too, and that the house was paid off, and that she wanted to be clear with me about her intentions before things got complicated later. Then she slid an envelope across the table to me. I looked at her. She said, "Open it." Inside was a check. I won't give you the exact amount, but I will tell you it had more zeros on it than I had ever personally held in my hands. It was made out in my name, from a bank I recognized, and it was signed in my grandmother's handwriting. That slightly shaky cursive she's had for the last decade, the one that still somehow manages to look elegant. I asked her if she was sure. She said, "I'm not senile, Lydia." I laughed. I couldn't help it. She told me she was giving the same amount to my aunt and my uncle, that she'd already sent their envelopes, that she wanted to do this while she was alive and clear-headed, because she didn't want things picked apart after she was gone. She said the house would go through the estate, but this was hers to give now, and she was giving it. I hugged her for a long time. She patted my back the way she always has. I drove home with the check in my bag, and I did not cash it immediately because I am the kind of person who needs to sit with large things for a few days before acting. I put it in the drawer of my nightstand, and I lay awake that night thinking about how long Nan must have been planning this, how quietly she'd done it, how little she'd ever said. What happened next I did not witness directly. I heard about it in pieces, first from my uncle, who called me the following Tuesday in a state of high agitation that I initially mistook for concern, and then later from his aunt herself, and then from Nan, who gave me the clearest account because she is the only one in this story who doesn't have a version of events to protect. My aunt and uncle had received their envelope. My aunt had opened hers on the weekend and, according to my uncle, had immediately called him. What I was told, and what was later confirmed, was that my aunt's position was that the checks were not legitimate, that Nan had been influenced, that someone, and there was meaningful eye contact in my general direction when this was later relayed to me, even though I wasn't in the room, must have gotten to her. My aunt said no one accumulates that kind of money quietly unless something is wrong. She said she'd spoken to her husband and that he agreed the whole thing felt irregular. My uncle, for his part, agreed with my aunt. This is his primary talent. They called Nan together, on speakerphone, and told her they were worried about her. They asked her if she'd been talking to anyone new. They asked about her lawyer. They asked if she'd been feeling confused lately. They did not ask any of this gently. Nan told me she stayed on the phone for 45 minutes and answered every question calmly because she knew exactly what was happening, and she wanted them to run out of road before she said anything else. Eventually, my aunt said she didn't feel comfortable accepting money that might be part of a situation that needed to be investigated. She said she was going to speak to a lawyer herself. And then, and this is the part I keep returning to, she deposited her check anyway. I want to be careful here, because I only have partial information about what happened with my uncle's check, but what I know is this. He did not deposit his, he tore it up. He did this, I believe, because my aunt told him to, and because he thought there was more money somewhere, and that tearing up the check was a kind of legal gesture that would give them grounds to claim the larger amount later. This is not how any of this works. But he didn't know that at the time. I didn't know any of this had happened until my uncle called me. He asked if I'd cashed mine yet. I said I hadn't. He told me not to. He said the checks were potentially fraudulent and that Nan needed a cognitive assessment and that I should hold off until things were sorted out. He used the phrase "for Nan's protection" 4 times in one conversation, which is 4 more times than he has ever done anything for Nan's protection in the entire time I have known him. I thanked him for calling. I hung up. And then I sat with Pepper on the couch for about 20 minutes trying to figure out how to feel. Here is the thing about growing up the way I did. You learn early that you do not have the luxury of making decisions from emotion. You think things through. You look at what is actually happening, not what people are saying is happening. And what was actually happening was this. My grandmother, a woman I have known my entire life, a woman who reads 2 newspapers a day and does the crossword in pen, had looked me in the eye and handed me a check, and told me she was of sound mind and clear intention. That was the fact I had. Everything else was noise. The following Monday, I deposited the check. I did not hear from the bank that day or the next. On Wednesday morning, though, my phone rang at 10:14 and the caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. I'm glad I didn't. The woman on the other end introduced herself as the personal banking advisor who managed my grandmother's account. I'll call her the banking advisor because her actual name is beside the point. She said she'd been asked to reach out to me directly. She said there was something she wanted to walk me through in person, and asked if I could come into the branch that afternoon. I told her I could. I spent the rest of the morning at my desk not accomplishing very much. When I arrived at the branch, she was waiting for me near the front. She was a composed woman in her 50s who shook my hand and led me back to a small meeting room off the main floor. She closed the door. She set a folder on the table. She told me that my grandmother had set this up very deliberately, that she'd been working with the branch and with her lawyer for the better part of 8 months, that the accounts from which the checks were drawn were registered in a specific way under specific conditions, and that before I left today, she wanted to make sure I understood the full picture. She slid a document across the table. My grandmother had what the advisor explained was a carefully structured gifting arrangement. The checks she'd issued to my aunt, my uncle, and me were part of a larger plan. The total amount was significant, more than I'd understood from the single check I'd received. The conditions were clear, the gifts were valid and legally documented. The money was real. The accounts were in order. Everything my grandmother had told me in her kitchen was confirmed on paper, in language I could read and understand, because as it happens I work with financial documents for a living. And then the advisor told me the part I hadn't known. Because of the specific way my grandmother's accounts were structured, because she had worked with her lawyer to set it up this way, any check that was not deposited within a defined window would be considered voided, and the corresponding funds would revert to a separate account. An irrevocable charitable account that my grandmother had established years ago and added to quietly over time. My uncle had not deposited his check. He had torn it up and, in doing so, had made it void. My aunt had deposited hers before launching her campaign of concern, and I had deposited mine. The advisor folded her hands on the table and said, "Your grandmother wanted me to explain this to you because she thought you'd appreciate knowing the full structure." She said Nan had been anticipating that not everyone would respond the way she hoped. She had built the arrangement accordingly. I sat in that meeting room for a moment after the advisor finished talking. I was looking at the document without really reading it anymore. I was thinking about my grandmother at her kitchen table with the vinyl tablecloth, sliding that envelope across to me, and the particular way she said, "I'm not senile, Lydia." Not defensively, just simply the way you state a fact about the weather. She had known. She had known how this was going to go, and she had structured everything so that the outcome didn't depend on anyone doing the right thing. It only depended on me doing the practical thing, which is the same thing she raised me, alongside my mother, to always do. I thanked the advisor. I shook her hand. I walked out through the main floor and through the glass doors and stood on the sidewalk in the gray October light and called my grandmother. She picked up on the second ring. I said, "Nan, I just left the bank." She said, "And?" I said, "You're really something, you know that?" She made a sound that was almost a laugh and said, "Your grandfather always said I played a long game." I did not hear from my aunt or uncle immediately. There was a stretch of about 2 weeks where my phone was quiet in the specific way a phone gets quiet when people are regrouping. Then my uncle called. He asked if I had deposited the check. I told him I had. There was a silence that lasted longer than comfortable. Then he said that was interesting because he'd been speaking to a lawyer, and that there was some question about whether Nan had been unduly influenced when she set all of this up, and that he was thinking about what options he had. I said, "What lawyer?" He named someone. I don't know if this person was a real lawyer or a friend who watched a lot of legal dramas. I said, "What's the basis for undue influence?" He said that I had been spending time with Nan and that this could be construed as, and he actually used the word construed, which was either impressive or someone else's word, a deliberate effort to position myself. I said, "I drive her to physio." He said that was exactly the kind of thing he was talking about. I told him I needed to go. I hung up and then I called my own lawyer, a woman I'd been referred to by a colleague who handles civil matters, and I explained the situation. She listened. She asked a few questions. She told me that what my uncle was describing would be extraordinarily difficult to argue. Given the documentation my grandmother had in place, the timeline over which the accounts had been structured, and the fact that there was a legal professional involved at every step. She said I should keep records of any contact that felt threatening or pressuring, and to let her know if anything escalated. Nothing escalated. My uncle made 2 more phone calls, both of which I let go to voicemail, and then stopped. My aunt sent a text message that was 3 paragraphs long, and that I read once, and then set my phone face down on the counter. The gist of it was that I had taken advantage of a vulnerable woman, and that the family would not forget this. I thought about the Thanksgiving dinner I hadn't been invited to. I thought about the Sunday morning calls Nan has been making for years to a granddaughter who picks up, while her own children scroll through their phones. I did not respond to the text. What I did instead over the following months was this. I updated my emergency fund. I paid off my car. I made an appointment with a financial planner. Not the bank's, a private one, a woman I'd found through a colleague who came highly recommended. And I sat across from her and told her what I had and what I wanted to build and where I wanted to be in 10 years. That conversation lasted 2 hours and I left it feeling like someone had handed me a set of blueprints for a house I'd been sketching in my head for years. I also helped Nan repaint her front hallway, which she'd been meaning to do since 2019, and which now looks very nice in a warm greige that took us 3 samples to settle on. She paid me, in lasagna, on a Sunday in late January. I was sitting at her kitchen table with a mug of tea, and Nan was watching a cardinal at the feeder, outside her window, and she said, without turning around, "Did your uncle call you again?" I said, "A few times." "Nothing serious." She nodded. Then, she said, "I want you to know that what I gave you wasn't about taking sides." I said I knew that, she said. "It was about recognizing who showed up." I didn't say anything. I looked at the vinyl tablecloth. I thought about all the mornings I'd sat at this table. As a grieving teenager, as a stressed university student, as an adult who sometimes still needed somewhere to be that wasn't her own head. She turned from the window and looked at me. "I had a good life," she said. "Your grandfather and I worked hard and we were careful, and I don't want what we built going to people who aren't going to be careful with it." She said it simply. No drama, no score settling. Just a woman who'd thought something through very clearly over a very long time. Outside, the cardinal flew away. Pepper, I'd brought her along in her carrier because she gets anxious when I'm gone too long, made a loud complaint from the hallway. Nan said, "That cat is ridiculous." I said, "She really is." We sat there for a while longer, drinking our tea, and it was exactly the same as every other Sunday morning, except that it wasn't, and we both knew it and neither of us needed to say so. I still talk to my aunt and uncle, barely. There are family events. Nan's birthday, Christmas, if we manage to coordinate, where we occupy the same room and behave civilly because Nan is there and Nan matters more than any of this. My aunt has never directly said anything to me about the check since that text. My uncle says even less than that. There is a layer of frost that I suspect will be there for a long time. I find I can live with that. What I cannot live with, what I have decided I am done with, is the feeling of being someone's afterthought, being the person who gets invited to Thanksgiving when someone remembers. Being the person who gets told to wait, to hold off, to not make any moves until the people who drove to physio twice in the last decade have had a chance to figure out their options. I changed my number, not because I was afraid, but because I was tired. I stopped being available in the ways I used to be available to people who had never once extended the same to me. I am still available to Nan. I am still available on Sundays at 11, before her shows. I was at the gym last month on a Tuesday evening and I ran into someone I'd gone to university with. A woman who'd been in my accounting cohort and who I'd lost touch with after graduation. We ended up getting coffee after and catching up, and at some point she asked what had changed because I seemed different, more settled somehow. I thought about how to answer that. I said I'd had a few things resolve themselves recently. She asked what that meant. I said it meant I'd stopped waiting for certain people to come around and started just moving. Making the next decision. Doing the next thing. She nodded like she understood, and maybe she did. The life I am building now is not dramatic. I take my grandmother to physio on Tuesdays. I meet a friend for dinner on alternate Thursdays. I am saving carefully and spending on things that matter. Pepper has adjusted very well to the new routine and has expanded her domain to include the entire left side of my couch, which I have accepted as a reasonable compromise. I don't think very often about the check itself anymore. I think about the fact that my grandmother built something over a lifetime of paying attention, of being careful, of taking the long view. And I think about what it means to be the person she looked across the kitchen table at and said, not with words, but with every deliberate decision she made over 8 months while no one was watching, "You're the one." I'm not angry at my aunt and uncle. I understand what happened. They saw something they wanted and they let their worst instincts make decisions for them. They assumed and they grabbed and they miscalculated, and now they live with that. That is entirely a matter between them and their own consciences. I only know what I know, which is this: I showed up. Not strategically, not because I was angling for anything. I showed up because she is my grandmother and she made me tea and she called me on Tuesdays when something was wrong, and that was enough of a reason for me. It still is.